Hello, and welcome to part two of three in this series on World War I. I'm Pushkar, and in today's video, we're going to discuss two different sections. The first section we're going to talk about is the plans that various countries made going into World War I. The first country we're going to talk about is Germany. Germany, because of its geography, and you'll notice that the geography of a country has a lot to do with the plan that it formulated going into World War I. But again, back to Germany. Germany would have to fight on two fronts, since Germany has borders with two of its enemies, Russia to the east, which came to be known as the Eastern Front, and France to the west, and as it came to be known as the Western Front. The French defense, which the Germans had to take into account, was the strongest at the border with the Germany. So the Germans had the knowledge that France's border was the strongest here. So the plan that the Germans formulated was to first conquer France and then take on the Russians at the Eastern Front. This is because the Germans anticipated the Russians to take weeks to mobilize their forces. So they, the German High Command, thought that that would buy them enough time to conquer France. And like was said in the previous slide, to avoid the strong and fortified border with France, the Germans decided to bypass that border and go through Belgium. So, to bypass this border, the Germans decided to circumvent that border and invade through Belgium. Now on to the French plan. For some backstory here, the French had lost some territory to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The old school of thought in France was to strengthen their defense based on the territory that they lost in a war to Germany. And after strengthening their defense, the French High Command thought to then counterattack once the war has started and is in full effect. But the plan that actually went through during the war was to initially attack with the utmost force. The French did not anticipate a large attack by the Germans from the left side. So they did not, in fact, anticipate this attack by the Germans. The next section is titled Stalemate. With both sides determined to win and both equally matched, because we looked at the alliances that were formed before World War I and how there was three countries, three major European powers in each of them, which made both the sides equally matched for each other. And all the countries in Europe having gone through militarism, forming alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, all of these factors combined gave rise to a stalemate. A stalemate is basically where neither side moves forward nor backward in a war. This stalemate led to fortifications that were already in place along the borders to be strengthened and trenches to be dug between these fortifications. The stalemate began in early 1915, the year in which even more countries decided to join the war effort. And here is a diagram of the trenches that were used to connect the fortifications that were in place. World War I is probably most famous for its trench warfare. With no outlook to advance, each army dug into their current standings. The war began to be fought in inches rather than yards or feet. Although heavily guarded, trenches were also heavily targeted by the enemy side, and soldiers were at constant risk of shelling and frontal attacks from their enemies. If you were a World War I soldier, though, most of your day would be spent lying around and hopefully not being the victim of the next shelling attack. And here is a picture of life in the trenches. Soldiers would lie around awaiting orders from their generals, but since doing a frontal attack on the other side was so hard, usually what that entailed was waiting around and defending their position. One piece of technology that arose from trench warfare were tanks. Tanks were invented to cross trenches and to provide armor against light fire. And they were helpful in frontal attacks or frontal assaults, which means for your side to go and attack from the front the other side. They would carry supplies and provide some fire against the enemy. Another piece of technology which led to trench warfare was the machine gun, which fired hundreds of rounds per minute, allowing soldiers on your side to protect your line with just one gun. And this is what made it very hard for World War I soldiers to just attack the other side, is that there would be rows and rows of machine guns awaiting them on the other side, which made it very risky to just run at the other side. A new technology that was used in World War I was the airplane, which was invented in 1903. This was a great time for its militarization, and it was used for reconnaissance, which is flying over enemy lines and looking at troop movements to gather evidence for your own side. They're also used to drop bombs on the other side. Another weapon that was used in World War I was the chemical weapons. These are poisonous gases, which were used by both sides, that can cause serious injury to internal and external organs. Soldiers during World War I had to be specially trained to prevent against injury. The most common form of prevention against these gas attacks was the gas mask. The Americans had a plan of their own. Over 4 million Americans were sent to Europe to fight in this war, starting in April 1917. America provided soldiers, supplies, and a huge workforce of factories and people back home. The fresh American soldiers also provided a morale boost for the Allied powers, which was much needed by this point in April 1917. The Germans attempted to break the stalemate in early 1918, but along with the help of American troops who boosted morale, the Allies were able to secure victory by late 1918. That's it for this section. I hope you've learned a little bit about the plans which countries formulated going into World War I, and also the stalemate that ensued because of the strength of both sides. In the next video, we'll discuss what came out of World War I and the after effects.